Stanford University.
Welcome to Stanford Medicine's 12th Annual Contemplation by Design Summit. I'm Dr. Tia Rich, the founder and director of Contemplation by Design. It's my distinct honor to welcome our next speaker, Caverly Morgan, who will be speaking to us about the heart of who we are, realizing freedom together. Caverly Morgan is a meditation teacher who blends the original spirit of Zen with a modern non-dual approach, drawing from her 8 years of training in a silent Zen monastery. She is the author of The Heart of Who We Are, Realizing Freedom Together, as well as a kid's book about mindfulness. Caverly is the founder of Peace in Schools, a nonprofit that created the nation's first 4-credit mindfulness class in public high schools. She is also the founder of Realizing Freedom Together, a nonprofit organization dedicated to making practices that lead to liberation for all, accessible to all. She has been teaching contemplative practice since 2001. Caverly leads meditation retreats, workshops, and online classes internationally. Please join me now in warmly welcoming Caverly Morgan.
Pia, thank you so very much for the warm introduction and for working with me throughout these prior weeks getting ready for this fantastic event. So thank you. Friends, another warm welcome to you. I'm so glad that you could join me for a period of contemplation together today, a time of inquiry. So thank you. Thank you for being here. I'd like to begin with a mindful minute. So come into any position that works for you to allow your feet to be making contact with the ground. Or if you're in a cross-legged position, bring some attention to the soles of the feet, just grounding by attending to your feet. And settling into the experience of fully feeling the breath. And give yourself a full minute to appreciate the breath. Sometimes in our contemplative practices, we focus on the breath, and perhaps less often we pause to say thank you, experience gratitude for this precious, life-giving breath. And then, please, taking 3 of the longest and deepest inhalations and exhalations you've taken yet today. Friends, thank you. If you would now, please, even though you might not be able to see each other, know that there are many of us here sharing this space. So if you would, put a few words in the chat, 1, 2, 3 words. What's alive now? What's here now? What are you present to? Anything's fine to report on. There's no right or wrong answer, just what's here. With this invitation, I'm very specifically wanting to cultivate an environment in which we're mirroring the vast awareness that allows for all experience. So here we are together mirroring this, allowing by being present to sounds, gratitude, peace and gratitude, student, teacher, connection, safe, peace, fighting turmoil, curiosity, gratitude, being, settling. Grateful for this meditation in a stressful situation, hope. Friends, thank you. This is from my book, The Heart of Who We Are, Realizing Freedom Together, and it sets the stage for where we will be going together during this next period of time. We all long to be happy, not happy as in glee, but deep contentment. We all long to feel at ease, to know that we're okay, that life is okay, to be at peace. And we're deeply habituated to look for this happiness outside us, to grasp and scramble for an experience that, at best, ends up being fleeting. Then, something that we long for again. We forget that this experience we long for is already seated in the heart of who we are and that it's always here. Have you ever touched this peace, this contentment, this deep knowing of who you truly are, and then struggled because you recognize the degree to which the world around you didn't reflect this experience of our true nature? Our true nature, oneness. Spiritual practice reveals the reality of oneness. Part of me feels called to write about this reality and nothing else, to live quietly, to meditate often, to be still, to perhaps make goat cheese on an island in the Puget Sound with my husband and our dogs. Friends, I'm smiling because when I wrote this book, I was living deep in the city of Portland, and I did not forecast that I would be moving to an island. So greetings today from the lovely Whidbey Island. Another part of me can't write or teach about this reality exclusively. I'm propelled by a deep call to address how in so many spiritual practice settings this oneness is named, yet not reflected in our daily lives as practitioners. Not to mention how many report feeling overlooked, excluded, and ignored in prominent spiritual communities, the realities of their lives unseen, even unwelcome. How can I, a former monk with a lifelong commitment to non-harming, talk about oneness while participating in systems that I recognize as harmful, systems that I can't be teased apart from? How can I speak about this reality of oneness without addressing the ways we often don't act on behalf of this knowing? How can I recognize the privileges afforded to me based on race and class while also coming to terms with the way in which it's not a quote unquote privilege to be part of a system of domination and othering? What do I mean by othering? Actions that arise from the perception of separation, behaviors that don't reflect the truth of oneness. This divide speaks to two realities: the reality of interconnection and oneness, the absolute reality, the reality of isolation and separation, our relative experience, where we enact the shared delusion that we are fundamentally separate from each other on personal and collective levels. These are two truths: the truth of the absolute and the truth of the relative. The relative, the conventional, the material, things as they appear to be. The absolute, the ultimate, things as they truly are. Empty. Empty. Not as in a grim void or kind of nihilism, not nothingness, but empty of objective experience, empty of language, empty of meaning, empty of separateness. Everything comes from something else. Everything is connected to something else. No thing exists in a vacuum. No thing stands on its own. Things simply appear to. Emptiness means empty of limitation. Emptiness means spaciousness. It means openness. Emptiness, the home of possibility, the great mystery where nothing is formed and nothing is known. So, friends, that's our frame for today, for our time together today. And then I also wish to lay some groundwork for our time together. So I wanted to discuss what I think of as some, going to point out some premise. Premise one. Today, I'm speaking from the recognition that we are the very thing that we long for, that we long for peace, happiness, love, fill in the blank. This time together today stands on the premise that these qualities describe our very being. They describe our true nature. So again, I'm not speaking about the happiness that's the opposite of sadness. Today, I'm focusing on happiness as a way to point to how we might describe what it feels like to rest in our very being. Our being is inherently peaceful, happy, or at ease. And love lives here. Love lies in the unity of being, in the heart of who we are. So, friends, that's premise one. Premise two. I'd like to say a little bit about defining who we are versus who we've been conditioned to be. That's a very important place of discernment because most of us are moving through the world acting on behalf of who we've been conditioned to be without necessarily pausing to question it often. So what do I mean by who we've been conditioned to be? If I refer to, and I will be today, if I refer to the conditioned mind, what does that mean to you? This is a chat moment, friends. If those of you that are near the chat would be open to putting in some words. If I say acting on behalf of the conditioned mind, how do you define that? What does that mean to you? Our conditioning, upbringing, and the people and groups we're surrounded with. Absolutely. Not my real self. Yes. Chasing successes financially, career wise, over true desire. Beautiful. Yes. Perfect, friends. So the conditioned mind, the mind that's shaped by society, culture, family, friends, religion, schooling. Saw one more come in. Okay. Acting on the conditioned mind, focusing on what I should do, quote unquote. Excellent. Yes, we get our shoulds from the conditioned mind. We turn to the conditioned mind to find out what the shoulds are. And beliefs, absolutely. Beliefs and assumptions are formed in the conditioned mind. So again, premise 2 is about making it clear that there's a distinction between the conditioned mind and the heart of who we truly are, or true nature, if you're coming in through a Buddhist doorway. If you're coming in through a Christian doorway today, the presence of God, sometimes it's referred to, our very being is referred to being in the presence of God. That experience refers to to an experience of what's true versus the illusory nature of the conditioning. So when we're identified, that means the attention is buying into the conditioned mind, and we're caught in the loop of seeking and resisting. Therefore, we tend to suffer. Premise 3. Even though our being is the very thing we've been longing for, and it takes no effort to be being, practice can be applied when we wish to live our lives from being. In the book, The Heart of Who We Are, I refer to acts of being. When we want to learn to stabilize in this recognition of who we are and have our actions align with this recognition, practice can support us. So this is a short excerpt from the book again. What we long for is our very being. We are what we've been striving after. Who we truly are, what we truly are, has been calling us home. Rest in who you are rather than trying to become who you think you should be. If you meditate to be a better person, you'll always be busy trying to be a better person. If you meditate because you're in love with resting in your own luminous, infinite being, you'll always be in love. Premise 4. This practice that I'm referring to doesn't need to be infused with the notion that through practice, you're finally going to be the right person, that you'll be able to respond versus react, and that you'll finally be more mindful, and that if you're more mindful, you'll be a better person, that you'll finally be more compassionate. All these things may be true, but we're exploring the how today versus the what. So the how is the process. Premise 4 is that practice can be free from striving to meet a conditioned standard and instead be full of love, celebration, and the joy of the remembrance of who we actually are. It's a different orientation to practice. That shift in orientation is the how. Being able to be more responsive versus reactive is the what. So the what might be the same, but the how very much matters when we're focusing on our shared desire to end suffering. And if you're here today with me, you too likely are interested in the ending of suffering personally and collectively. Premise 5. Premise 5 is that practices that support us in remembering the heart of who we are can be applied not only personally, but collectively as well, as I just mentioned. And that if we wish to live in a world that is not dominated by the kind of division that we're seeing around us today, then I'm proposing that this step is required. Okay, friends, those are the foundational pillars. And now I'd like to go back to premise 1. This is the premise that suggests that we are what we seek. So when we try to get what we're looking for through objects, we're perpetually unsatisfied. We get identified with the seeker, and we're confused about who we really are. And by through objects, I simply mean the objects of the relative plane. So I will get this experience of peace that I long for um, by having a better exercise regime. Again, it's not what, it's how. So that might be very supportive to me. But if I'm bringing this attitude of through these things, I'll finally get the very thing I long for. What happens if I can't do those things? What happens if I break my leg? Does that mean I don't have access to the piece of my being? So the how is, again, very important. And most importantly for this premise, I want to underline that we are the thing we've been looking for, that our very being is the thing we've been looking for. If I'm identified with the seeker, I'm identified with the conditioned mind. So, who are we? In the neti-neti approach, neti-neti is Sanskrit for not this. The idea is that we come upon who we actually are through a negating process, negating what we are not. I am not these thoughts. I am not these emotions. I am not this body, etc. This is the approach my monastic training took. We focused on the nuances of being able to see clearly what we are not. What are these conditioned thought processes? How do they unfold? How do I get identified with them? Very valuable exploration. But this premise is about recognizing that alongside that type of exploration, we can also go directly to the experience of who we are without focusing so much on the negating. We can just go straight to our true nature. And in this approach, I'm suggesting that we don't need to turn these two approaches into a hierarchy. There may be a moment where it's incredibly helpful to give the attention to what we are not. There may be another moment where it's incredibly helpful to simply go straight to your being and not give any attention at all to, for example, a spinning mind, strong emotions that are arising. So I want to invite you to have an opportunity to experience this directly now. This will be brief, just some moments in which I will guide an experience that, again, is an invitation to go straight to the experience of being. I was on a podcast recently, and I left the podcast incredibly inspired to explore new pathways, new for me, not new for the world. Many brilliant teachers over the years have come up with wonderful pathways to directly experience our own being. But I found myself leaving this podcast realizing that for most of us, our experience of being is so blended with what the attention is focused on throughout the day that we lose touch with the being. So for today, I'm going to use being and awareness itself as interchangeable. So awareness is always in the backdrop of our experience. Being is always here in the backdrop of our experience. But if we use this word awareness, it makes it very clear that sometimes we're quite focused on what we're aware of. We lose touch with awareness itself. We're fixated on what we're aware of, or sometimes even just focused on what we're aware of. Fixated might be too strong of a word. Either way, often we lose touch with what's in the backdrop of our experience. So I want to invite you to pause now and come into any position that is comfortable for you. This is not a formal meditation where I'm going to be asking you to sit in a specific posture. This is about letting your body be at ease and perhaps inviting the mind to be at ease. So take a moment to play along with me, friends, and I'm going to invite you to fill in some blanks here. I am aware of, and then just fill in the blank. So for me, in this moment, I might say, I am aware of the gentle hum of the refrigerator. I am aware of sensation in my belly. Fill in the blanks and take just a moment or two. I am aware of. I am aware of. I am aware of. And now take a moment to see the things that you've named you're aware of all up as if they were lit up on a screen. The sensations, the sounds, the thoughts, whatever you're aware of, just see these things that you're aware of on this screen in your mind's eye. And then visualize these objects, these things that you're aware of, quietly starting to dissolve. But notice as these things dissolve, the awareness is still there. we can experience awareness without the object. In other words, we can experience awareness directly instead of indirectly through the process of focusing on an object. So now, with these objects dissolving, simply stay with, I am aware. Rest in, I am. Being simply is. I am. Who is that? What is that? Does it have boundaries, borders? Is it limited or constricted? And then one more time for today, taking 3 long, deep inhalations and exhalations to close out this short contemplation. Thank you. So again, come to the chat for those of you that are close by and able to do that. Tell me what's here now. As you take a moment to go directly to your very being, what do you notice? Recognizing that words are already a step away from the direct experience, and yet how lovely that we have words in which we can explore the nature of our being. So Lisa, sense of being, of calm, quietness, peace, calm, existence. Beth, peace, relief, a sense of emptiness, openness, space, silence, birds chirping, release, connection, and connectedness. Thank you, friends. And by the way, if anyone's having a completely different experience, you're experiencing agitation, please know that there's no problem with that. To me, it would simply suggest that your conditioned mind is not open to allowing for an experience of transparency so that you can more directly experience being beyond the activity of the conditioned mind. It's not bad, it's not wrong. It just means that the identification with that state is strong right now. If that's going on, you might simply bring some care to the part of you who's feeling agitated. In other words, don't stress about that. We're describing qualities. Everyone has written qualities in the chat that are ways to point to our true nature. They're ways to point to our very being. So again, there's a neti-neti approach where we can recognize what veils being. As I was just pointing to, if we're really agitated and we're identified with that agitation, we're identified with one of the veils. When we're identified with the veil, we tend to feel limited, constricted, cut off, separate. We likely will suffer due to that. When we're resting in our own being, we tend to describe that experience as one of peace, relief, openness, spaciousness, empty, and inherently connected, as you all have. So I want to focus, if this approach of neti-neti is available to us, and as I've pointed out, that can be an incredibly useful tool, being able to recognize how and where we're getting identified with the conditioned mind. I want to speak now to this more tantric approach of going into experience rather than negating experience. So this is a short passage, very short passage from the book. It's called The Costumes of Consciousness, or the costumes of awareness, based on how I've been using the word awareness today. Consciousness and awareness, for today's purposes, I'm also using interchangeably. So the costumes of consciousness. In activity, you, awareness, hide behind things. In the noise of the world, you appear clothed. In silence, in stillness, you emerge naked. In stillness, you are found everywhere. So in one approach, it could be said that true nature can be veiled by the activity of the conditioned mind. And then in the other approach, this activity is seen to be nothing more than a variation of consciousness within consciousness, a coloring of reality. So I wanted to share with you today, friends, on this topic, one of my favorite Zen stories from the Platform Sutra. Hongren, the fifth patriarch of the Chinese Zen lineage, was recognized as an enlightened master in the 600s CE, and a senior monk who apparently really prided himself on being very learned, and who had always had an eye on becoming the sixth patriarch, presented a verse to the master to exemplify his understanding and, let's face it, to impress him. So here's the verse. The body is the Bodhi tree. The mind is like a clear mirror. At all times, we must strive to polish it and must not let the dust collect. So then along comes Hui Ning, this illiterate woodcutter from the quote unquote barbarian South, as those from the North at that time labeled such people. And because we're focusing on collective liberation as well as personal liberation today, friends, I have to say, like, Does this sound familiar? There's nothing new about this delusion of othering. Huining offered the following alternative verse. There is no Bodhi tree, nor stand of a mirror bright, since all is void. Where can the dust alight? Hongren recognized the depth of Huining's understanding, and Huining became the sixth patriarch, the head of the Chan Zen Buddhist order in China. Pretty big deal. Huining apparently had to be given the title in secret and was instructed by his teacher to flee the monastery lest the other envy-filled monks try to kill him. It's kind of another story, but again, not unrelated to this larger conversation about collective conditioning. So we've defined the conditioned mind. We've defined how conditioning creates the shoulds, as someone on this call said. In my book, I also talk about collective conditioning. What kinds of collective conditioning are we often identified with as collectives? So one example of that would be the collective distortion of power over versus power with. Just a little aside. So this story illustrates the truth that all is void or empty, that all is consciousness, all is awareness, all is made of being. There is nothing outside this. And given that fundamentally all is void, there are no things. This void is within all things, and all things cannot exist without it. So, in reference to premise 2 now, this notion of being free from the loop of seeking and resisting, how do we do this? By resting in being, in our true nature, by letting the attention come home to awareness itself. As mentioned, awareness gets mixed up with what we're aware of. And in that, we forget about awareness itself, focusing on what awareness is aware of and having the subject-object divide be at the forefront of experience. So I am the subject being aware of this object. Today, what I'm inviting you to directly experience is that we can be aware of being aware. We can be aware of awareness itself. Awareness is inherently aware of itself. So we can let the attention that is usually going out to objects of experience come home to being. And we can also utilize this exploration of the conditioned mind as a way of being clear about what tends to veil being. For example, being is usually veiled by being identified with a limited sense of self and all of its activity. So in my years of teaching, one of the most common blocks that I often see is the identification of believing the voice, whatever I do isn't enough. This is just being used as an example of a very common veil that, again, I see with regularity. That kind of belief keeps me in a limited sense of I versus the vast, direct experience of I am, the knowing again, experientially, of I am. So, in reference to the premise that personal practice must be applied collectively if we want to realize freedom together, I thought it could be fruitful to explore one example of how we could do that. What does that mean? Many of you on this call today know the power of being able to recognize negative self-talk. You know, how you can see how getting identified with that negative self-talk veils being, and it keeps us identified with a small and limited sense of self versus the vastness of being. That, especially monastically, when I was training, that was one of the most powerful practices I learned. Being able to notice when I was engaged in commentary inside the mind, like whatever I do isn't enough. When we're identified with negative self-talk, it can feel so intimate that we don't even hear it as the voice of negative self-talk. We're just believing whatever it's asserting. So, and then we're acting on behalf of those beliefs. So now as we focus on what collective practice potentially look like, I want to use this practice of being able to see negative self-talk, disidentify from the negative self-talk, return the attention to being. I want to come to this practice in a collective form, and that would be to recognize what I speak about in the book as negative other talk. So we can bring attention to how, for example, implicit bias, which we can recognize by paying attention to our internal conversations about others, also keeps us identified with a limited sense of self. And how that perception locks in the view that others are contained with the limitations that we project onto them. So this is only one example. We could also explore our survival strategies personally as a way of seeing how we get stuck in limitations. So, for example, my personal survival strategy, one, would be believing that I have to get things right in order to be lovable. Someone else might feel I have to be seen as a valuable helper, contribution in society in order to be worthy of love. These are survival strategies, conditioned survival strategies. Practice lets us see through this and experience freedom. So when I was training monastically, we focused exclusively on personal survival strategies. Well, what happens when we focus on our collective survival strategies? I, for example, identify as someone with close proximity to societal power and privilege, conditioned power and conditioned privilege. If I unpack this collective strategy, I find things like the belief that there's only a limited amount of fill in the blank. We need to be buying into a power over other model because there's no room for power with if we're going to get our needs met. So that would be an example of a collective survival strategy. If you find it fruitful, you might begin journaling about some of the collective survival strategies that you recognize you've been seeped in as you've been raised or as you raise your own children. What world are we swimming in when it comes to our collective survival strategies and our collective conditioning. So, in summary, friends, the first premise states that we're inherently what we seek: peace, happiness, love, and that these qualities are qualities that describe our true nature. The second premise differentiates between who we are and who we are conditioned to be, emphasizing that identification with the conditioned mind leads to a loop of seeking and resisting. The third premise suggests that practice allows us to live from being, stabilizing our recognition of who we are. The fourth premise highlights that practice can be free from striving to meet conditioned standards and instead be filled with love, celebration, the joy of remembrance of our very being. Premise 5 is that practices that support us in remembering the heart of who we are can be applied not only personally, but collectively. Through knowing our true self, we can be free from seeking and resisting and apply these concepts to both personal and collective conditioning. Let us carry the profound understanding that the peace, happiness, and love that we seek are not distant aspirations, but intrinsic aspects of our very being, and that by consciously choosing to live from this place of inherent wholeness, freeing ourselves from the conditioned loop of striving, resisting, we unlock boundless potential for personal and collective transformation. And that this journey of remembrance can be filled with celebration and joy. And it's not just for our own individual benefit, but a powerful catalyst for a world yearning for unity. So I invite us to commit to this shared journey together, friends, recognizing that by realizing freedom within ourselves, we ignite a beacon of hope and possibility for all, transforming our world into a reflection of the profound peace that resides in the heart of who we truly are. So friends, thank you. Tia, thank you so much for your presence. We will now move to Q&A.
Thank you, Caverly, for providing a clear and inspiring framework, offering us a path to freedom. The first question picks up on your distinction around awareness and awareness being able to be aware of itself. Could you speak to whether there is a distinction between awareness and beingness?
Thank you. I am in this session using those things interchangeably. What I like about using this interchangeably is that sometimes if I say being, for some folks, it can lack the luminous quality of being, aware being. And for some folks, a word like consciousness can be heady, kind of clunky, almost scientific. So I like to play with the words awareness, consciousness, and being. And I invite the listener to see which word ignites what for me is just all different ways to point to the same thing. So awareness is inherently, in its nature, aware of itself, the way that the sun illuminates itself. The sun also illuminates objects. So in the little contemplation we did in the middle of the session today, we were starting by noticing how the sun illuminates objects, but then we're returning to the experience of being the sun, illuminating itself, the sun being aware of itself. Being is being itself knowingly. Consciousness is conscious of itself.
Thank you. Building on that, we ask the tonal quality and the emotional attitude toward the conditioned self, that the being self may be observing, how the being self is observing the conditioned self. What would you offer as a way of that relationship being shaped with certain emotion and certain tonal quality?
Well, the deepest, in the realm of the absolute, pure consciousness doesn't actually know limitation, because pure consciousness has to constrict itself. It assumes limitation in order to know itself as a finite self, or as a conditioned mind. But that doesn't speak to the listener's question about tonal quality. So I wish to take this in another direction, but I would feel remiss not to name that. Most people described resting in being as inherently peaceful, open, spacious, empty. I find that it's also applicable to use the word love. Love is a way we can describe the unity of being. Why do we love being in love with other people? Because we feel not only that we're connected, but that we're one, that we're made of the same thing. So if it's useful to you when you recognize that you're getting identified with the conditioned mind, you might remember that from being, that identification is happening within a container, within a context of love. Think of a unconditionally loving mother with a child acting out. If it's a good day, she has plenty of room, infinite patience for the child to simply be the child. And she can hold that experience that the child is having in the embrace of unconditional love. So as the conditioned mind does what the conditioned mind does, a practice that we can apply is the practice of noticing whether we're caught in another form of identification, trying to resist the conditioned mind, trying to get rid of the conditioned mind, pushing the conditioned mind away in any form. And we can return our attention to unconditional love, to recognizing that awareness itself, being, is untarnished by the activity of the conditioned mind. It's unharmed. It's the activity of the conditioned mind doesn't leave traces of disturbance in being itself. There's actually only love. Thank you.
Thank you. The next question says, what are some ways you work towards being internally content as opposed to seeking happiness from external objects?
Such a beautiful question. And this speaks to the power of practice, of having pathways we can choose instead of the habit. This person is correct. The habit is strong to seek for happiness in outside objects. And it can be confusing for us because those outside objects are they provide a temporary happiness, but the lasting peace that we all long for comes from learning to have the attention rather than go outward to that striving process. Remember, it's not what, it's how. So the how, there's nothing wrong with going and getting a new car. But if I'm going to get a new car with the idea that then I'll finally be happy, that's where we get into trouble. So the practice is, as you watch the attention go down that slippery slide, you can start to catch it sooner and sooner if you're paying attention in that very moment. Consciously return the attention. Let the attention be released from the object and return home to being. Let yourself find the thing you're looking for through the object without having to go indirectly through the object to get it. Hopefully you had a little taste of that today. And as I mentioned, if you didn't, it's okay. The mind didn't have the porosity to explore in that way today. That's not bad. It's not wrong. But listen to this again. Or there are many different teachers that guide us to direct experience of being, but I do have some meditations on Insight Timer and my website. Check out some of these meditations, which are all often, not always, sometimes guided imageries with a different intention, but often attempts to support us in returning home to the heart of who we are. Because the more we practice that, the easier it is to live our life from that ground of being. Thank you.
Tying in your wise response to a speaker here at Stanford, Anna Lemke, who wrote a book, Dopamine Nation, if you would speak to the delusion of a person who may not be seeking sustained happiness from external objects, but may be self-soothing with short periods of a dopamine high from an external object. So they buy the car, they buy the new outfit of clothes, or they buy the fancy meal to stay distanced from their suffering. How would you address that habitual, cyclical consumer of the external object versus the broader sense of arriving at final happiness?
Well, I very much appreciate this question. It's difficult for me to tell whether what's being said is if a person's suffering because they keep doing this and they're only getting these little hits, or if actually it's an important part of the person's healing because these initial hits give them a reprieve from the intensity of their suffering. So I'm not feeling clear in this moment. I don't know if the person can put it in the chat. I'm sorry, I missed the name. Can you say the name again, Tia?
Anna Lemke is a professor at Stanford who speaks about the dopamine addiction that's prevalent in a consumer culture. And the response you're raising of it's, of course, distinct for individuals and how the process may play out. I think in general, the idea that's put forward by the Dopamine Nation model is that there's no movement towards healing. It's a trap of a cyclical process of an entire life spent on that repeated sort of pushing the lever for the dopamine response as the only way to live.
Yes, and indeed, and it. I think we're in a very important time. As you know, Tia, I founded Peace in Schools. I have a lot of intimacy with what it means to work with teenagers around contemplative practice. And let's just take for a moment the relationship with the phone.
Mm-hmm.
When I was a teenager, I did not have a smartphone in my pocket that I was getting dopamine hits from through an activity that becomes very habitual of scrolling. constantly reaffirming a sense of who I am in relationship with the objects that I'm seeing. So yes, if we're if we're going to point to the way in which that will be an endless loop that will never bring lasting peace, I am on that wagon. I'm right there with that conversation. And I'll use the teenagers as an example. I find that many people are quick to say, we just need to get technology away from them. First of all, that's not going to happen. But second of all, I've learned in bringing more attention to what it means to create trauma informed practices. We don't actually have to make that process of getting a dopamine hit bad or wrong. So many teens, for example, are looking for an experience of connection. What I am committed to doing is creating experiences of connection that are better reflections of our inherent connection, rather than these flimsy, felt, fleeting experiences of connection. So if we don't make it wrong to get, I'd rather have a teen get a flimsy, fleeting experience of connection because someone on Instagram just posted something that they feel connected to, than no experience of connection at all. They're in complete an experience of total isolation. So I'm leaving room for nothing wrong with, I ate that cake, I feel better. But how can we let that feel better become a taste of a larger feel better? So instead of making the feel better something that we now need to diminish in some way, we can see that it was a glimpse of something, and that if we want to be free, we are required to go beyond the glimpse. We're required to stay seated in the experience, that for a moment the veil was pulled back and we got to taste.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Our next question is, I'd love to hear more about finding this peace and applying it collectively in light of the highly aggressive efforts to take away fundamental human rights in the United States at this time.
Thank you so much. I want to acknowledge we are in a time where I don't know if Tia, are you familiar with the phrase the Kali Yuga?
I am not.
I believe it's originally a Hindu phrase, but it refers to an era of darkness, and we are in an era, a chapter where division is heightened. The identification collectively with the illusion of a self that is separate from life is heightened. So what arises for me to acknowledge in this moment is, for me, that it actually increases my commitment to be the alternative. And again, I'm coming in through the doorway of a monastic out in the world, and I can only speak from a direct experience of how, especially in the creation of peace in schools, I have literal and tangible examples, also in the retreats that I lead, of collective transformation, of people entering a space, feeling a sense of othering, other than, and watching that be healed through a retreat, even a short retreat, if focused on the unity of being. I've watched that veil of othering be able to be seen through, not transcended, seen through. We're not spiritually bypassing what is. We're seeing through it. We're experiencing the unity of being. And because of the doorway I come through, that's my best contribution to this deep passion for the evolution of human consciousness, for the experience of us realizing freedom together. My contribution is to be able to support folks in returning to the heart of who we are and then live on behalf of this recognition. And to do it in groups as collectives. My book has these collective practices and personal practices that are applied collectively in the book. And when I was publishing It Was Sounds True, I asked, can we make this book only for collectives? And they shot down that idea, and for good reason. There are plenty of people who just want to read that book on their own. But I mention this because of the power of practicing as a collective, moving towards collective freedom. I want to say all that because I want to also uplift and create space for the way in which someone on this call coming in through a different doorway is going to have a different contribution to the evolution of human consciousness. If you're an academic, your contribution is going to be packaged and look in a different way. And I think that's an incredibly important part of this movement, the movement of light through darkness.
Thank you. May I pose the remaining two questions?
Of course.
All right, thank you.
Thank you.
An individual asks, please speak to how to practice when one feels threatened and abused by another person.
Because I see so much spiritual bypassing in our world, I wish to directly speak in the beginning to what not to do. It could be tempting to listen to a talk like this and think, oh, I just need to go to my experience of the absolute and recognize that my being is untarnished by harm that someone else is causing me. While that is true, your being has never been harmed. It cannot be harmed. Your infinite, luminous, ever-present being is unscathed by conditioned activity. On the relative plane, it's important to tend to whatever harm is being caused, to make sure you're finding beloved community, to practice in settings where this awareness that on the most fundamental level you have not been harmed can be the backdrop of experience while you lovingly tend to your nervous system, for example, which may be very affected by what has happened in your life. So my encouragement is to find spaces where both those realities can be held, where you can work with whatever traumas and hardship and difficulties have arisen in the container of knowing that on the most fundamental level, you are inherently whole. You are not broken. You don't need to be healed because you are that which is by nature inherently whole. And you can bring a lot of love to the parts of you that have felt diminished or harmed. And I hope that you'll do that as you heal.
Thank you. And building off of that wise guidance, the last question has to do with burnout. And particularly, this is a person writing in our line of work as teachers, helpers, healers. How do we avoid the focus on striving to help others? How can we focus more on our being in order to help others? There is so much work to do, and I find it easy to overstretch myself, to burn out.
Well, first, thank you for your work. Those of us that get burnt out because we're in these fields out of love. No one becomes a teacher to get rich. So we're in these fields for love. And a huge practice can be to bring the same care and love that you're bringing to those externally to yourself. That can be done as a practice. And again, today we're focusing on how in being, there's nothing to practice. There's no one to practice it. But we get identified with the conditioned mind. So practices are the very pathways back to a direct experience of being. So Kristen Neff and I, Dr. Kristen Neff and I have been doing a lot of work together, focusing on taking her work of self-compassion to a new space, and that is the exploration of who is the self in self-compassion. That's a continuum. I would invite you to be practicing self-compassion while also holding questions, holding inquiry in your heart, inquiry like, what is it that uh, that is applying love to burnout? Give yourself the opportunity to recognize you are that fundamentally. So the practice is to learn to disidentify in a consistent way with the habit of perceiving yourself as that which has to strive in order to fill in the blank. And to let the actions of your day, if you're a teacher, you're very busy, to let the actions of your day be arising out of this ground of being we've been focusing on. In order to be established in such a ground of being, I have found for myself that it takes practice to be able to return home and stabilize there. So again, practice of self-compassion, the practice of inquiry. Who am I? What is it that applies love? The practice of presence. Thank you.
Caverly, thank you for your wise teaching that helps us to all more fully understand love. Thank you.
Tia, thank you so much. I'm looking forward to the rest of the day and tomorrow with Janice and Peace in Schools at the summit, and then at the end closing out with David Zimmerman. Thank you so much for the opportunity to be so involved in this experience. And friends, thank you so much for joining the summit at large. I feel that it's such a lovely contribution. So thank you, friends.